Hey everyone, welcome. There are cities we know only as pictures. The Colosseum, the Forum, the Trevi Fountain. You've probably seen them all, even if you've never actually been to Rome. But a picture and a real city are two very different things. A picture doesn't smell, it doesn't make noise, it has no basements or sewers. A picture doesn't remember how everything began. Today we're going to try to see not just the picture but the actual city. The way it was before it became a symbol. And the way it remained long after that symbol seemed to disappear. 3,000 years is a serious claim for one story. So let's be honest right away, this is always a choice. We chose what seemed the least obvious, the least mentioned, and the most alive. A lot got left behind the scenes. And if this story interests you, there's plenty more to dig into. In that sense, Rome is inexhaustible. There will be one single question guiding us from beginning to end. A question that Rome asks every city that came after it. What actually makes a city immortal? It's not size. It's not military power. It's not beauty and it's not age. It's something else. And we're going to approach the answer slowly. Through swamps and senates. Through bread and circuses. Through fires and 1,000 years of silence. Rome was built on agreements. Between patricians and plebeians, between Rome and its allies, between the emperor and the legions. So here's ours. Hit that like button right now in advance. I promise you a story after which you'll either fall asleep or want even more. If I don't deliver, you know where the button is. You can always take your like back. I accept the challenge. Make yourself comfortable. And I don't mean just sit back. I mean actually find a position where you can stay for the next while without wanting to move. Turn off everything unnecessary. We're not in a hurry. Drop in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. We genuinely love seeing the geography. It surprises us every time. If you have ideas for the next cities or topics, write them there too. We read everything. And if you manage to fall asleep tonight while listening to this story, write tomorrow and tell me roughly where it happened. We're not starting with the legend of the she-wolf and the two brothers. We're starting with the swamp. Because, as it turns out, that's where everything truly great begins. Imagine a valley between 7 hills sometime in the 9th century BC. Not a city yet, just a swampy lowland cut through by the Tiber River. In spring, the river would overflow and flood everything below the hills. In summer, the standing water turned into a breeding ground for malaria. The humidity was so high that wood would rot in a single season, and unbaked bricks would dissolve after the first rain. People lived up on the hills where it was drier and there was at least some breeze. The valley between them was no man's land, useless for anything. And yet, this is exactly where a city would emerge that would eventually conquer half of the known world. But first came engineering. The Etruscans, the northern neighbors of the Latins, brought drainage technology to this region. What would later be called the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, began as an open canal designed to drain water from the valley into the Tiber. Later it was covered with a stone vault, widened, and integrated into the fabric of the city. Some sections of this system were still working during the height of the empire, 600 years after it was built. Parts of it are still functioning today, at least according to the Roman utility services, though they tend to have their own opinions about everything. Once the valley dried out, space appeared. And space between the hills is a natural meeting point for people from different hills. That's where they began to trade, then to negotiate, then to argue in public, which, in a way, is the beginning of politics. What would centuries later become the Roman Forum, the heart of the Republic, the place where the fate of provinces and generals was decided, started as a simple marketplace on drained swamp land. All that greatness literally grew out of the mud. Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans, 3 peoples living on neighboring hills. 3 languages, 3 sets of gods, 3 systems of customs that didn't particularly like one another. The Great Sewer drained the valley between them and unintentionally created a neutral territory. The city didn't exist yet, but the conditions for it were already in place. Shared infrastructure turned out to be a stronger glue than shared blood or shared gods. Rome would use this principle for a very long time and far beyond Latium. It's important to understand that Rome was never a city in a beautiful location. It was a city in a convenient location, at the crossroads of trade routes, near a ford across the Tiber where roads from the south, the north, and the sea all met. And from the very beginning, its creators had this reflex: to turn the inconvenient into the convenient and problems into advantages. The swamp became the foundation, literally. The legends would come later. The she-wolf, the two brothers, the sacred furrow, fratricide as an act of foundation. All of that appeared when the city needed an official biography. But that's another conversation, and we'll return to it later. For now, let's remember the main thing. Rome didn't begin with a myth. It began with an engineering solution. And that, as it turns out, is very much in its style. Every great city eventually decides it needs a beautiful story about itself. Not necessarily a true one, a beautiful one. One that explains why this particular city, right here, right now. Rome solved this question with its characteristic straightforwardness. It took two brothers, a she-wolf, the will of the gods, and fratricide. Put it all together, and no one was bothered by the internal contradictions. According to legend, Romulus and Remus were the grandsons of King Numitor, who had been overthrown by his own brother. Their mother, the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia, gave birth to them by the god Mars, which immediately removed any awkward questions about their origins. The children were thrown into the Tiber, a she-wolf nursed them and a shepherd raised them. Later the brothers restored their grandfather to the throne and founded a new city themselves. And then Romulus killed Remus, either over an argument about the city's boundaries, or because Remus had jumped over the sacred furrow. Rome took its name from the one who survived. Of course, this is a myth. But it was a myth that did very specific work. First, it gave the city a divine origin through Mars, which immediately placed Rome above neighboring Latin communities. Second, fratricide as the founding act wasn't just a dramatic detail, it was a metaphor for monopoly on power. There can be only one city and only one king. Whoever doubts that, we know how it ended for Remus. The royal period, which according to tradition lasted from the founding of the city in 753 BC until the expulsion of the last king in 509 BC, left us 7 names: Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Martius, and then 3 Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius and Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud. The very presence of Etruscan kings on the Roman throne tells us more about the real balance of power in the region than any legend. In the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Rome was not the center of the world. It was a small settlement in the zone of Etruscan influence. But the kings left behind more than just names. Servius Tullius, who is credited with the first census and the division of the city into tribal districts, essentially laid the administrative foundation that would survive him, the Republic, and even the Empire in some of its elements. The city was learning to count and organize itself, and this skill would prove more important than any military victories of the early period. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, went down in history not so much for his actions as for being the reason they stopped. His son raped a noble Roman woman named Lucretia, who then took her own life. Her relatives raised a rebellion and the king was expelled. The Republic was born as a reaction to personal tyranny, as a solemn oath that this would never happen again. Whether they kept that oath is another question, but the moment itself is important. Rome invented not only a legendary past for itself, but also a legendary transition to a new order. Romulus as the founder and Tarquinius as the last tyrant. Both images were needed by later Rome as reference points. The first explained where everything began. The second explained why things went differently. Between them lie 2.5 centuries about which we know surprisingly little. But we know very well what came after. 509 BC. Tarquinius is expelled, and the Romans face a question that humanity has solved in different ways in different corners of the world and at different times. If not a king, then who? The answer Rome gave turned out to be so successful and so significant that its echo can still be heard in the constitutions of the 21st century. 2 consuls. Not 1, 2. Elected for 1 year. Each had the right to veto the other's decisions. This wasn't just a division of power, it was a built-in mechanism to prevent tyranny. If one wanted too much, the other could say no. If both wanted too much, there was the Senate. This whole structure was designed around one fear: that never again should there be one man with unlimited power. Under the Republic, the Senate was far from a decorative body. 300 men, at first exclusively patricians, later more and more plebeians, an assembly of people who had experience, resources, connections, and long memories. The Senate didn't pass laws in the modern sense, but its recommendations carried such weight that ignoring them meant going into open conflict with the entire Roman elite at once. Caesar tried that. We know how it ended. But the Republic had a crack from the very beginning. The patricians, the old aristocratic families, controlled the priesthood, the magistracies, and the Senate. The plebeians, all the other free citizens, paid taxes, served in the army, and had almost none of the privileges. This inequality was no secret, and the plebeians were not going to put up with it. 250 years of struggle. Not a revolution, not a classic civil war, but a slow, stubborn pressure. Secessions, when the plebeians literally left the city and refused to serve in the army until they received concessions. Tribunes, new magistrates with the right of veto, inviolable by law, whose job was to protect ordinary citizens from the arbitrariness of the patricians. The Law of the 12 Tables, written around 450 BC, the first codification of Roman law, which made the law public and stopped allowing patricians to interpret it however they wanted. By the 3rd century BC, plebeians had gained access to the consulship, to priestly colleges, and to most magistracies. Technically, the Republic had become more open. But more open does not mean fair, because the new elite that emerged from the richest plebeian families quickly merged with the old patrician one and recreated the same closed system, only with a longer list of names. This is how Rome learned another lesson that it would apply constantly. To preserve the system, you sometimes need to reform it. Not radically, not to the foundations, but enough so that those who could destroy it would get something and walk away satisfied. It was cynically simple and at the same time brilliantly effective. At least up to a certain point. That moment when effectiveness ran out would come later. For now, while Rome was building its institutions, arguing, negotiating, and slowly becoming the city that would need its own face, its own voice, and its own place for public conversation. If you want to understand what made Rome different from most cities of its time, don't look at the temples or the walls. Look at the Forum, at what it existed for and how it was used. It will tell you more about Roman civilization than any list of conquests. The Roman Forum was an elongated square between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. Over time it became lined with temples, basilicas, triumphal arches, and speaking platforms. But at its core it was a place for conversation. Public, loud, often brutal conversations where everything was decided. Laws, wars, sentences, triumphs. The city literally governed itself out loud, in the open air, in the presence of anyone who wanted to listen. This is where the extraordinary role of oratory in Roman culture comes from. The ability to speak was not an addition to power, it was power itself. Young aristocrats spent years studying rhetoric not as decoration but as a weapon. Whoever could persuade the crowd and the Senate had influence, even without an army. And whoever had both an army and the gift of speech could have everything. Cicero is the best example and the best warning at the same time. A man of non-noble origin from the provincial town of Arpinum, he built his entire career solely through the power of words. He became consul, suppressed the Catiline conspiracy, and received the title Father of the Fatherland. All of this without a single legion behind him. Only speeches, only persuasion, only the Forum. But the Forum gave power and it also took it away. When Caesar came, then the triumvirate, then Antony, Cicero found himself on the wrong side. His speeches against Antony, the Philippics, were brilliant and deadly dangerous. Antony did not forget. After Caesar's assassination, in the chaos of the struggle for inheritance, Cicero was added to the proscription lists. His head and hands, the very hands that had written the Philippics, were displayed on the speaking platform in the Forum, right where he had delivered his greatest speeches. This is not a digression from the topic. This is the topic. The Forum was the place where Rome talked to itself, and where the price of a word sometimes equaled the price of a life. Public space as an arena in the broadest sense. Physically, the Forum changed along with the city. Every significant ruler added something of his own, a temple, a basilica, an arch in honor of a victory. The smell of sacrifices, the scent of torches in the evening, the roar of the crowd on election day, the silence after a sentence was announced. All of this layered on top of one another for centuries. By the late Republic, the Forum was no longer just a square, it had become the memory of the city written in stone and marble. The Republic it served would last for a few more generations after Cicero. But the cracks that had appeared in it long before him would only grow wider. The Forum would see many more things. Triumphs and executions, speeches after which the course of events changed. Until one day it would see a man who decided that talking was no longer enough. But that's the next chapter. There are rivals who make you better, and there are rivals who force you to become something else entirely. Carthage was the second type for Rome. 3 wars, almost 120 years, and in the end it wasn't just a victory, it was a decision that historians still argue about today. The city was razed to the ground. The land was cursed. Salt was sown into the soil. Whether the salt part is legend or not, the image speaks for itself. You don't destroy an enemy like that. You destroy a fear like that. Carthage was a mirror of Rome in the most uncomfortable way. It was also a republic, also a trading empire, also had ambitions over the entire Mediterranean. Where Rome built roads and cities, Carthage built fleets and trading posts. Where Rome integrated the defeated, Carthage kept them at a distance. 2 different ways of building power. And they could not exist side by side forever. The First Punic War began in 264 BC over Sicily, an island both sides considered theirs. Rome, which until then had never seriously fought at sea, built a fleet in just a few years by copying a captured Carthaginian ship. They literally took it apart, figured out how it worked, and built 200 of their own. Then they learned how to sail them. That's very Roman. Take something foreign, improve it, and give it back with interest. But the real test came with the Second War and with a man named Hannibal Barca. He crossed the Alps with an army and elephants. In winter. Through mountain passes where modern climbers go with high-quality modern gear. He lost half his army and most of the elephants along the way. And still, he crushed the Roman legions at Lake Trasimene. Then at Cannae, a battle that military academies still study today as the perfect example of encirclement. For 16 years Hannibal marched across Italy and could not take Rome. He couldn't because most of Rome's allies refused to switch sides. This was the moment when Rome's system of integration showed its true strength. People who had received Roman citizenship or Latin rights were not eager to trade them for the promises of a Carthaginian general. Rome was losing battles, but it was holding its network. Scipio Africanus did what seemed illogical. While Hannibal was ravaging Italy, he sailed to Africa and struck at Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled to defend his home city. At Zama in 202 BC, the Carthaginian army was defeated, and with it died the idea of an equal rival to Rome in the western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War was no longer a war, it was a verdict. Carthage was dismantled stone by stone in just 3 years. What had taken centuries to build disappeared in the time it usually took Rome to construct a single aqueduct. And in the ashes of that city, Rome was left alone with its ambitions and with its problems. Problems that no external enemy could silence anymore. Victory over Carthage made Rome the most powerful city in the Mediterranean. But it also planted a time bomb under the Republic that would explode several generations later. It's a paradox, but a completely logical one. Great victories change the victor no less than the vanquished. The problem started with the land. While Roman farmer soldiers spent years fighting in Spain, Africa, and Greece, their farms fell into decay. When they returned, they often found their land mortgaged, sold, or so neglected that restoring it without capital was impossible. And there was no capital, only soldiers' pay, which was barely enough to get home. Meanwhile, rich Romans bought up these lands and settled them with slaves, tens of thousands of people brought from the newly conquered provinces. Sicily, Spain, Greece, Asia Minor, every victory meant a new flood of slave labor onto the Italian market. Large estates called latifundia, worked by slaves, pushed out small-scale farming as inevitably as a big supermarket pushes out the corner shop. Only much more brutally. Slaves in Rome were not a uniform mass. There was a complex hierarchy, from an educated Greek teacher in an aristocratic house to a man working in a silver mine in Spain, where the average lifespan on the job was measured in months, not years. In between were craftsmen, household servants, gladiators, scribes, and doctors. A city of 1 million needed every category and demand never dropped. But let's go back to the landless farmers. They went to the city because they had nowhere else to go. Rome was growing, it accepted them, fed them grain from Egypt and Sicily, and entertained them with spectacles. But the former independent farmer, who once had a voice in the popular assemblies and could defend his position with weapons, turned into an urban proletarian dependent on state bread and entertainment. Social degradation covered with full stomachs. That's a recipe for instability with a delayed effect. The military system was also cracking. Traditionally, only a citizen with a certain property qualification could be a legionary, a man who had something to defend. But when small landowners disappeared, the army began to feel a shortage of recruits. The reforms of Marius at the end of the 2nd century BC solved this problem by opening the legions to anyone who wanted to join. At the same time, they created armies that were loyal to their commanders personally, not to the Republic. But that came a bit later. The conquests brought Rome wealth that is hard to imagine. Gold and silver from the provinces, tribute, trade, slave labor, all of it accumulated in the hands of the nobility and the equestrians, a narrow elite that controlled the Senate and provincial administration. The gap between the richest and everyone else became a chasm that rhetoric about Roman values and the virtue of the ancestors could no longer cover. The Republic, which had been born as a counter to the tyranny of one man, quietly turned into an oligarchy of a few hundred families. Someone had to notice this and say it out loud. And such people appeared. Two brothers who are still remembered today. Tiberius Gracchus was a quaestor in Spain when he saw what he could not unsee. Fields that once fed Rome were now worked by slaves to enrich a few families, while free citizens crowded the cities. He returned to Rome and decided to do something about it. In 133 BC he became tribune of the plebs and proposed a land reform. The proposal was actually quite moderate. It limited the amount of public land one family could rent. The surplus would be redistributed to landless citizens. Nothing revolutionary, simply a return to the old Licinian law that had existed but had been ignored for decades. The Senate, however, reacted as if it were a declaration of war. His fellow tribune Marcus Octavius imposed a veto. Tiberius did something no one had done before him. He took the question of removing Octavius directly to the popular assembly and won support. It was constitutionally questionable and politically explosive. A tribune removing another tribune through a crowd vote, bypassing the Senate. The reform passed. A land commission was created. Tiberius ran for a second term, which was also against tradition. In the summer of 133 BC, a group of senators led by the Pontifex Maximus Scipio Nasica left a Senate meeting. They grabbed the legs of their chairs and marched to the Capitol, where Tiberius was holding the popular assembly. They killed him right there. Several hundred of his supporters died with him. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. A ritual denial of proper burial. Public humiliation even after death. The precedent was terrible. Not the reform. The precedent. For the first time in Roman history, an internal political conflict was resolved by the physical elimination of an opponent. The senators were saying, "There is a line beyond which we no longer talk." The younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, learned the lesson but drew the opposite conclusion. When he became tribune in 123 BC, he acted on a larger scale and faster. He passed a grain law guaranteeing cheap grain for the urban poor, judicial reform that limited senatorial control over provincial courts, and a program of colonization and road building. He tried to build a broad coalition. And he almost succeeded. In 121 BC the Senate declared a state of emergency, the first senatus consultum ultimum in Roman history. It was essentially permission for the consuls to act by any means necessary. Gaius and his supporters retreated to the Aventine Hill. Consul Opimius attacked with armed men. Gaius either died in battle or, according to another version, ordered his slave to kill him so he wouldn't be captured. 3,000 of his supporters were executed afterward. The Republic showed that it knew how to devour those who tried to fix it. And every subsequent reformer, looking at the fate of the Gracchi, faced a choice, either back down or take up arms. Cicero would back down. Caesar would take up arms. Gaius Marius and Sulla were the general rehearsal for what would happen with Caesar, only without the final act. Marius was elected consul 7 times, already a violation of all norms, reformed the army and relied on the personal loyalty of his soldiers. Sulla twice marched his legions on Rome, something that before him was considered literally unthinkable. The first time to regain his command, the second to become dictator and rewrite the constitution. Then he voluntarily resigned and retired, dying of natural causes, which was unusual for Roman dictators. Sulla left behind a system meant to strengthen the senatorial republic. Instead, he left behind the understanding that legions could be marched on Rome, and if you won, you could get away with it. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC into a patrician but impoverished family. He spent his youth in debt and political intrigue, gaining a reputation as a brilliant orator and a dangerous opponent. The Gallic Wars, which lasted from 58 to 50 BC, turned him into the richest and most popular general in Rome. And at the same time into a problem the Senate didn't know how to solve. When the Senate demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he faced a choice. Returning without his army meant trial and almost certainly exile or worse. Crossing the Rubicon with his legions meant formally starting a civil war. In January 49 BC he crossed it. What happened next is known to everyone. Victory over Pompey, dictatorship, reforms, the Ides of March 44 BC, and 23 stab wounds in the building of Pompey's theater because the Senate was under repair. The conspirators thought they were killing a tyrant and saving the Republic. Instead, they killed a man and triggered the mechanism that would finally destroy the Republic. Because after Caesar came Octavian and he drew his own conclusions. You don't need to call yourself dictator. You don't need to openly concentrate power. You need to keep the form of the Republic and quietly fill it with different content. Princeps, first among equals. No tyranny, God forbid. Technically, the Republic would continue for several more decades after Caesar. The Senate would still meet, consuls would be elected, the forum would buzz with speeches. But it would all be theater. A beautiful, convincing theater with good actors. And one man behind the scenes who decided everything. The forum we left at the end of the first chapter would see all of this. And it would remain silent. Octavian returned to Rome after his victory over Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BC as the man who held the entire Roman world in his hands. Provinces, legions, the treasury, the fleet, everything formally or in practice answered to him. The question wasn't whether he had power. The question was how to name that power so that Rome would accept it. He chose the word princeps, first among equals, the first citizen. Not king, not dictator, not tyrant, words that made the Roman elite twitch. Just first. In 27 BC he solemnly returned power to the Senate and the people, and the Senate, with equal solemnity, asked him to stay and continue governing. They played this scene with such conviction that some contemporaries may have actually believed it. It was then that he received the title Augustus, the sacred, the exalted one. The name Octavian disappeared from use forever. The genius of the system he built lay in the fact that it cancelled nothing. The Senate continued to meet, consuls were still elected, popular assemblies were still held. Everything looked like a republic, and at the same time it no longer was one. Augustus simply accumulated in his own hands a set of traditional powers. Tribunician inviolability, proconsular imperium over the provinces where the legions were stationed, the right to convene the Senate. Each of these powers had a precedent on its own. Taken together, they gave him absolute power without passing a single new law. Under Augustus, Rome literally changed its face. He said that he had found the city built of brick and would leave it built of marble. And this was not empty boasting. The Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars the Avenger, the rebuilt Pantheon, new aqueducts, restored old temples. The building program lasted for decades and transformed the center of the city into what we recognize in modern reconstructions. Architecture as a political statement. Rome looks this way because its ruler is worthy of Rome. But Augustus understood that marble alone was not enough. He carried out moral reforms, legislation on marriage and childbirth, the restoration of old religious cults, and support for poets who sang of Roman virtues. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, Horace wrote his Odes, Livy wrote his monumental history of Rome. None of this happened without state support. A cultural program to complement the architectural one. Power that shapes not only space but also memory. He ruled for 45 years and died in his bed in 14 AD at the age of 75, an almost unbelievable achievement for a Roman ruler. The system he built proved so resilient that it survived several openly terrible successors. Caligula, Nero, names that became synonyms for tyranny, did not destroy the Principate. The system was stronger than the men who ran it. That is perhaps the most accurate assessment of Augustus. He built not just a regime but an institution. Bad emperors damaged it, good ones improved it. But it endured for another 200 years after him. Somewhere at the beginning of the 2nd century AD, Rome's population crossed the 1 million mark. It was a figure that no European city would reach again for the next 1500 years. London would only approach it in the 19th century. What did that mean in practice? To feed, water, house, and somehow keep in order 1 million people in a pre-industrial era? It was a question whose answer still amazes us today. Grain. That was the foundation and the constant anxiety. Rome consumed about 200,000 tons of grain every year, mostly wheat from Egypt and North Africa. Under Roman rule, Egypt essentially became the emperor's personal granary. The province was governed separately from the rest. Senators were forbidden to enter it without special permission. The monopoly on the grain flow was simply too important. Ostia, the port city at the mouth of the Tiber 20 kilometers from Rome, received cargo ships from all over the Mediterranean. There the grain was transferred to flat-bottomed barges and towed upstream along the Tiber to the city's warehouses. The Horia, enormous grain stores that stood along the riverbank. And the Annona, the state grain supply service, tracked reserves, prices, and distribution. When something went wrong, a hungry crowd in the city was a far bigger problem than any external enemy. The real Rome did not smell of marble. It smelled of kitchens and cesspits, tar and animals, wet wool and rancid oil. The streets were narrow, paved with uneven stones. Walking them at night without a torch meant risking broken bones or the contents of chamber pots that residents of the upper floors simply emptied out the windows, sometimes with a warning shout if they were polite. Insulae, multi-story apartment buildings, were Rome's solution to high-density living. 5, 6, sometimes 7 floors high. The ground floor was occupied by shops and wealthier residents. There the walls were thicker, fire risk was lower, and you didn't have to climb stairs. Higher up, it was cheaper, more cramped, hotter in summer and colder in winter. The poorest lived on the top floors with the worst views of other people's roofs and the highest risk of burning to death, because fires in the insulae were regular occurrences. The aqueducts supplied the city with about 1 million cubic meters of water per day, a figure that makes you think about your own modern utilities. 11 main aqueducts, some over 100 kilometers long, delivered water by gravity through arched bridges and underground tunnels. Street fountains, public baths, and private houses of the wealthy, all of it was held together by an engineering system whose maintenance required constant and expensive work. This city could not exist without a state that organized it. And the state could not exist without the city that legitimized it. Mutual dependence, that was the real foundation of the empire. In 72 AD, Emperor Vespasian began building a new arena on the site of an artificial lake that had belonged to Nero's complex. 8 years of construction, 100,000 cubic meters of travertine, 4 floors, 80 arches around the perimeter, and seating for 50,000 spectators. The Flavian Amphitheater, its correct name, would later be called the Colosseum from the Latin colossus, because of the giant statue of Nero that stood nearby. For a city of 1 million, this was not just entertainment. It was an operating system for managing the crowd. The formula bread in circuses, panem et circenses, belongs to the poet Juvenal, who wrote it with bitter irony. This is all the Roman people want now, he said, the people who once distributed commands and consulships. But the authorities took this formula not as a reproach, but as an instruction. Free grain calmed the stomach. Spectacles calmed the mind. Gladiators were the stars of their time in the most literal sense. Their names were written on city walls. Researchers still find graffiti in Pompeii discussing specific fighters and rating their performances. A successful gladiator could win freedom, money, admirers and status. An unsuccessful one, death. Although real statistics suggest that most fights did not end in death. Gladiators were expensive property, and the owners of the schools protected their fighters. But the Colosseum was not only about gladiators. Animal hunts, naumachii, naval battles with the arena temporarily flooded, public executions of criminals and enemies of the state turned into spectacles. All of this together made up programs that could last for several days in a row during major festivals. Animals were brought from all over the empire. Lions from Africa, bears from Britain, crocodiles from the Nile, elephants from India. The scale of the logistics is staggering, even without considering that all these animals were alive and not always willing to cooperate. The psychology of the crowd in the Colosseum interested the Romans themselves. The lower tiers, where senators and equestrians sat, saw one show, refined and at a distance. The upper tiers, where women and the poor stood, saw something else, a filled square of people all shouting the same thing at the same time. That effect of unity, when 50,000 people of different origins, languages and social status shared one single moment. That was the real function of the arena, not just to entertain but to remind everyone, there is us. The emperor in his special box, visible to all, was not just a privilege, it was a duty. To appear before the people, to decide the fate of a wounded gladiator with a gesture, to share with the crowd a moment of tension and release. All of this was work. Bad emperors ignored this work and paid for it in popularity ratings, which in Rome had very practical consequences. The Colosseum stood long after gladiatorial combats ended, and long after Rome itself emptied. Medieval families used it as a fortress, then as a quarry, then as a symbol. It still stands today, a bit worn but recognizable from any angle. The city around it has changed 10 times over, yet it remains and watches. The period from the accession of Nerva in 96 AD to the end of Marcus Aurelius's reign in 180 AD would later be called by Roman and subsequent historiography the Golden Age, or the rule of the 5 good emperors. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. 5 reigns in a row without bloodshed during succession, without mass executions of senators, without obvious madness in decision-making. Against the background of what came before and after, it really does look like gold. Trajan expanded the empire to its maximum extent, Dacia, Arabia, Mesopotamia. Trajan's column in Rome still stands and still tells the story of the Dacian campaigns in detailed spiral reliefs. It is the best preserved military report from antiquity. Hadrian traveled personally through the provinces, building and strengthening borders. He built his own wall in Britain and his own mausoleum in Rome, the one that would later become Castel Sant'Angelo. Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was both a reality and a construct. Inside the borders there was indeed relative stability, trade and movement of people and goods on a scale the Mediterranean had never known before and would not see again for a very long time. The Greek reader Aelius Aristides wrote with admiration that for ordinary people the borders had become almost invisible. Travel wherever you want, trade with whomever you want. This was true for a certain category of people. But while Rome flourished at the center, life on the frontiers was different. The Danube frontier, the Rhine frontier, the Euphrates frontier, legions stood there and someone was always trying to get in or get out. Marcus Aurelius spent almost his entire reign not in Rome and not writing philosophical notes in comfort, but in field camps on the Danube, fighting off the Marcomanni and Quadi. He wrote his meditations between campaigns, which gives that text a completely different dimension than if he had written it in a luxurious library. And here it is worth mentioning the Antonine Plague, the epidemic that swept through the empire between 165 and 180 AD and took, by various estimates, between 5 and 10% of the population. Soldiers from the Parthian front brought the disease back to the legions. The legions carried it to the provinces and trade carried it to the cities. Rome may have lost 250,000 people. No one knows exactly because no one was counting at the time. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD in a camp on the Danube and left behind a son, Commodus, one of the greatest disappointments in Roman history. A man who had spent his entire life on self-improvement and governance handed power to someone who dreamed of performing as a gladiator in the arena under the name Hercules. The principle of heredity defeated the principle of selecting the best. And the Golden Age ended not with a bang but with a quiet sigh. After Commodus, a crisis would come that would put everything into question. But before that, Rome still had about 20 more years at its peak, under the last of the 5 good emperors. in a military camp, with a notebook and stoic thoughts about duty. In 235 AD, Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered by his own soldiers in a camp near the Rhine because he tried to negotiate with the Germanic tribes instead of fighting them. His successor, Maximinus Thrax, lasted only 3 years. After him came Gordian I and II, father and son, both in the same year. Then Pupienus and Balbinus, chosen by the Senate and killed by the Praetorian Guard just a few months later. And this was only the beginning of the list. In the space of 50 years, from 235 to 284 AD, Rome had at least 20 different emperors. Most of them died violent deaths at the hands of their own troops. The system that had held power together for 2.5 centuries suddenly revealed its true vulnerability. It had rested on the consent of the army, but the army was no longer united. It was scattered across the borders, broken into regional factions. And each faction had its own candidate for emperor. The crisis was not only political, it was systemic, and all its elements reinforced each other in the worst possible way. The plague of Cyprian, which broke out around 249 AD, was killing up to 5,000 people a day in Rome alone, according to some estimates. Trade networks shrank, cities grew smaller. Small land ownership, already weakened during the Republic, finally collapsed under the pressure of endless requisitions and taxes. Money lost value at a speed that reminds us of the worst examples of the 20th century. The silver content of the denarius, the main coin, fell from about 80% under Augustus to less than 5% by the end of the crisis. Merchants refused to accept the coin at face value. The army demanded payment in goods, and the state responded with requisitions. It was an inflationary spiral with no brakes and no central bank to stop it. External pressure gave no respite. On the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic tribes, the Alemanni, Goths and Franks, pressed with growing strength and organization. In the east, the Persian Sassanid dynasty replaced the Parthians and turned out to be a far more dangerous opponent. In 260 AD, Emperor Valerian was captured alive by the Persian king Shapur, the first and only Roman emperor to be taken prisoner by an enemy. Shapur had this scene carved on a rock relief that still survives today. How this crisis looked from the inside is a question that is rarely asked. For a person in a provincial city somewhere in Spain or Asia Minor, the name on the coins changed more often than the seasons. Someone would arrive, collect taxes, and leave. Then another would come, declare the previous one a usurper, and collect taxes all over again. The army would camp a kilometer away and either buy food or simply take it, depending on the commander's mood. Rome managed to emerge from this state thanks to Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD and carried out reforms so radical that he essentially created a new state on the ruins of the old one. This was already a different system. And in it, Rome, the city, was gradually ceasing to be the center of the state that still bore its name. Diocletian divided the administration of the empire among 4 rulers, the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, and settled not in Rome but in Nicomedia in the east. This was a symptom that few at the time read as a diagnosis. Rome was ceasing to be a functional center of the state. It was too far from the Rhine frontier, too far from the Euphrates, too large and too expensive to manage. Constantine, who won the subsequent civil wars and gathered power into his own hands by 324 AD, made 2 decisions that would change the next 1,000 years. The first was to legalize and support Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. The second was to found a new capital on the site of the ancient city of Byzantium on the Bosporus and name it after himself, Constantinople. The legalization of Christianity was primarily a political decision, even if it was wrapped in religious rhetoric. At the beginning of the 4th century, the Christian Church was the only organization in the empire that had a widespread network, a unified administrative structure, a disciplined hierarchy, and connections in every city from Britain to Mesopotamia. Integrating this network into the state structure meant gaining a ready-made administrative apparatus that would have taken far too long to build from scratch. Constantinople was built deliberately in the image of Rome. 7 hills, a forum, a senate, and a hippodrome instead of the Colosseum. A copy of a city meant to surpass the original. Resources flowed there, power concentrated there, and from there the richest and most urbanized eastern provinces were governed. Rome remained a symbol, but it stopped being the headquarters. For Rome itself, this meant a gradual, at first almost imperceptible, contraction. Fewer state contracts, fewer officials, less inflow of people and money from the provinces. The city of a million began to shrink slowly, like air escaping from a balloon through a tiny hole. The inhabitants didn't feel it every day, but over a generation the difference became noticeable. Constantine's successors would turn support for the church into the state religion, and gradually push paganism to the margins. Old temples would be closed or converted. The Vestal Virgins, who had kept the eternal flame of Rome burning for 700 years, were disbanded at the end of the 4th century. The Olympic Games, held since 776 BC, were abolished in 393 AD as pagan. A 1,000-year-old cultural layer was being stripped away faster than seemed possible. Rome did not disappear and did not stop, but it was already living on inertia, great, respectable, still impressive inertia, rather than its own momentum. In August 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric entered Rome through the Salarian Gate. The city was plundered for 3 days. Then Alaric moved south and died the same year from illness, never having decided what to do next. The Goths eventually settled in Aquitaine in the southwest of modern France, and became federates, allies of the empire they had just sacked. The material damage from the sack of 410 was significant, but not catastrophic. Rome had survived worse: fires, epidemics, and famines. What it had never experienced before was a blow to the idea. Rome was considered the eternal city, protected by the gods and its own invincibility. And now it had fallen. St. Augustine wrote, "The city of God," partly as an answer to the question that troubled the intellectuals of the time. If Rome has fallen, what is happening with divine providence? The next 65 years were a slow disintegration. The Huns appeared from the Eurasian steppes and by their pressure pushed Germanic peoples deeper into Roman territory. Not always with evil intent, often simply out of desperation. Attila devastated the Balkan provinces and reached Gaul, but withdrew after meeting with Pope Leo I. One of those scenes that is difficult to explain rationally, but which nevertheless happened. In 455 AD the Vandals sacked Rome again, this time more methodically and for longer. The last Western emperors became puppets in the hands of Germanic military commanders who either served Rome or used Rome as decoration for their own power. Romulus Augustulus, the last of them, was deposed in 476 AD by Odoacer, the leader of the Heruli, who had served in the Roman army. Odoacer sent the insignia of imperial dignity to Constantinople with the message that the West no longer needed a separate emperor. Constantinople accepted the regalia and raised no objection. 476 AD is a convenient date for textbooks. But the people who lived at the time did not know they were living at a turning point of eras. Odoacer ruled Italy quite competently. The Senate continued to meet. Consuls continued to be elected, right up to 534 AD. The church continued to function. Most institutions simply passed under new jurisdiction, changed their sign, but kept their procedures. The end of great systems rarely looks like an explosion. More often it looks like the lights gradually being turned off in empty rooms. First the distant ones where no one has lived for a long time. Then the closer ones. And at some point you notice that you are sitting in the dark. But no one remembers exactly when the last light was switched off. At its peak, somewhere in the 2nd century AD, about 1 million people lived in Rome. By the 6th century, only 20 to 50,000 remained, depending on which researcher you believe and how you count. This was not a reduction, it was a completely different order of magnitude. A city built for 1 million, with its aqueducts, grain warehouses, public baths, and administrative apparatus, suddenly had to serve the population of a small provincial town. The aqueducts stopped working one by one. Not because they were destroyed but because there was no one left to maintain them. A complex engineering system requires constant supervision and repair staff. When the staff disappeared, the water disappeared with them. The baths, which consumed thousands of cubic meters of water per day, were closed. The fountains fell silent. People returned to wells and the Tiber, just as their ancestors had done 1,000 years earlier. The Forum, which once buzzed with crowds and speeches, gradually became overgrown. Marble slabs were taken for building materials, not by barbarians but by the Romans themselves who needed stone for newer, smaller buildings. Temple columns were repurposed for churches. Bronze statues were melted down. The Great Sewer, which had given birth to the city, continued to function because its design did not require active maintenance, but it now carried away much less. Cows grazed on the Forum. This is not a metaphor and not an exaggeration. Medieval chronicles and archaeological finds confirm it. The same square where Cicero delivered his Philippics, where Caesar celebrated triumphs, where the fates of provinces were decided, became a pasture. Locals began to call it Campo Vaccino, the cow field. The bitter irony of fate, written directly into the topography. But the city was not empty and dead. It was simply different. A small, tight-knit community living among giant ruins adapted what remained to new needs. The Colosseum became a fortress and a residential quarter. Hadrian's mausoleum became a castle. The theater of Marcellus became a palace for an aristocratic family. The Pantheon, the only building that survived almost intact, survived precisely because in the 7th century it was turned into a church and gained a protector in the person of the Pope. The ruins became the new landscape, and people lived in them as naturally as we live among modern cities. They grazed cattle between columns, built huts leaning against the walls of amphitheaters, and buried the dead in old sarcophagi. In their perception, this was not a tragedy. It was simply life among what was left. And in this smaller, quieter, reshaped city, something new was already growing. Something that would fill the vacuum and give Rome its next existence. Completely unlike the previous one but no less enduring. When the state retreats, someone always steps in to take its place. It's not exactly a law of nature, but it happens often enough to feel like one. In the Rome of the 6th and 7th centuries, that someone was the church. Not because it actively sought power, although some of its representatives certainly did, but simply because it was the only structure left standing. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, did not inherit armies or treasuries from the empire. What he inherited was a network and authority. A network of parishes, monasteries, and church lands stretching from Sicily to Britain. Authority based not on legions, but on something much harder to destroy with a sword. In a city whose population had shrunk to just a few tens of thousands, the church fed the poor, settled disputes, negotiated with barbarian chieftains, and organized the repair of bridges, because there was no one else left to do it. Gregory I, who became Pope in 590, left behind a correspondence of over 1,000 documents. An administrative miracle for a man governing a city in the middle of plague, Lombard threats, and the complete collapse of civil authority. He negotiated directly with the Lombards when the imperial exarch in Ravenna either could not or would not. He organized grain supplies from the church's estates in Sicily. He sent missionaries to Britain. Gregory was a bishop, but he functioned as the city's prime minister, without a government. Medieval Rome looked like a spiderweb in a broken window. The old urban fabric, forums, baths, villas, was crumbling or standing empty. New construction concentrated around churches and monasteries, which served simultaneously as spiritual centers, shelters, hospitals, and warehouses. The city contracted toward the Tiber and the Vatican Hill, where there was water and where the Basilica of St. Peter stood over the tomb of the Apostle. Pilgrims began to arrive. At first sporadically, then in ever greater numbers. Rome had something no other Christian center could offer: the tombs of the Apostles Peter and Paul, the catacombs filled with the relics of martyrs, and the simple fact that it was the city where it had all begun. Religious tourism and pilgrimage became the economic foundation on which medieval Rome slowly rebuilt itself. Not as a political center but as a sacred place. This was a new existence, more modest, quieter but more resilient. The city survived as the capital of the church when everything else around it had changed beyond recognition. Rome did not die. It simply changed roles. And in this new role, it would last for another 1,000 years before it began to build again. The year is 1420. Pope Martin V returns to Rome after decades of the Avignon captivity, when the papal residence had been in France and Rome had effectively been left without a master. Martin begins what will take the next 100 years. the systematic revival of the city as the papal capital. This was not romance or nostalgia for antiquity. It was politics. Rome had to look the part so that no one would doubt the authority of the one who ruled it. Churches were repaired, roads were paved, and the Aqua Virgo aqueduct, the first in many centuries, was restored. Water returned to the city. Humanists and antiquarians who came to Rome in the 15th century looked at the ruins very differently from the medieval inhabitants. Where locals saw a convenient stone quarry, the newcomers saw Cicero and Virgil, greatness and a lesson. Poggio Bracciolini wandered among the ruins with notebooks, recording inscriptions, fragments, and details. Rome was not yet being systematically excavated, but it was already beginning to be read. Nicholas V, Pope from 1447, openly formulated the program. Rome must become the most beautiful city in the world, worthy of the chair of St. Peter. Under him, the rebuilding of the Vatican began. The library grew to thousands of volumes. Architects and artists were invited. This was no longer mere survival, it was ambition. Michelangelo arrived in Rome for the first time in 1496 as a 20-year-old sculptor. He would die here in 1564 at the age of 88, barely leaving in his final decades. In that time he managed to create the Pietà, paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, design the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and redesign the Capitoline Hill. At 75 he was still directing the construction of the largest dome in the world and climbing the scaffolding every day. A character perfectly suited to the city. Renaissance Rome was a city of such sharp contrast that it sometimes seems impossible they existed in the same space. The luxury of cardinal palaces and the poverty of the neighborhoods just around the corner. Ancient marbles and papal gardens and filth in the streets. Brilliant artists and patrons who killed each other in feuds. Rome has always known how to hold opposites in one hand, not resolving the contradictions but simply living with them. If the Renaissance spoke to people through harmony and reason, the Baroque spoke through the body and emotion. 17th century Rome became the largest stage in the world for this new language. And two men more than any others defined how the city still looks today, Gian Lorenzo Bernini and Francesco Borromini. Rivals who hated each other with a consistency that almost commands respect. Bernini, the Pope's favorite, socially brilliant, productive at an almost inhuman speed. Borromini, gloomy, solitary, a genius in details so intricate that architects still study his curved lines and complex surfaces. In the end, Bernini won the battle for commissions and glory. Borromini died by his own hand in 1667, leaving behind a handful of churches unlike anything else in the city. St. Peter's Square with Bernini's colonnade is one of the greatest public spaces ever designed by a single person. 284 columns embracing the square like arms in an embrace. Bernini himself described it exactly that way, and the image is precise. The space was created for crowds, for spectacle, for the feeling that you are being welcomed and enveloped by something greater than yourself. This is not just architecture or sculpture, it is psychology translated into stone. Fountains became the language of power in the Baroque era. The Trevi Fountain, the Fountain of the Four Rivers, the Fountain of the Triton, the fountains at Piazza del Popolo. Each one demonstrated both technical achievement and the generosity of its patron. Water in a city that had lived on wells for 1,000 years was itself a miracle. Water shooting upward and scattering in the air among sculptures. This was a spectacle designed for effect. Propaganda that needed no words. Pilgrims and travelers who came to Rome in the 17th century entered a city deliberately designed as a machine for producing impressions. Straight streets leading to obelisks and squares. Churches that suddenly revealed themselves after narrow alleys. Perspectives calculated to appear longer or taller than they actually were. Rome had learned from its best students, the Roman directors of triumphs and spectacles, and was now applying those lessons with new technology and new faith. The city became a capital once again. Not of a state but of the imagination. And this role would prove remarkably durable. In 1798, French troops entered Rome and proclaimed the Roman Republic. Pope Pius VI, old and ill at 80 years old, was taken to France as a prisoner. He died there a year later without returning. French commissars carefully listed what they were taking from Rome: Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, ancient artifacts, everything of value that could be moved. Some of it ended up in the Louvre, where it remains to this day. Napoleon regarded Rome with the same ambivalence he showed toward any great idea he had not invented himself. On one hand, there was the obvious temptation, the city of the Caesars, a symbol of empire, a source of legitimacy for someone who wanted to build a new empire. On the other hand, the inconvenient reality of papal power, which did not fit any rational scheme of governance. Napoleon tried to solve it in his own way. In 1809 he simply annexed the Papal States and declared Rome a free imperial city, the second capital after Paris. The next pope, Pius VII, was also taken to France, this time to Fontainebleau. He spent 5 years there, refusing to sign documents that would have given Napoleon the ecclesiastical legitimacy he so desperately wanted. This stubbornness of an old man in captivity against Europe's most powerful military machine is one of those moments where character proves more important than armies. Napoleon eventually gave in and released the Pope, because without the Church's blessing his power felt incomplete. Under French administration, Rome received a few practical improvements. A new street system, the first attempts at systematic excavations on the Forum, and house numbering. The French administrators approached the city with Enlightenment rationalism, trying to organize, catalog, and make it manageable. Rome responded with its characteristic passive stubbornness. It accepted the new rules, continued living in the old way, and waited. After Napoleon's defeat, the Pope returned to Rome in 1814. The city greeted him with such enthusiasm that contemporaries were surprised. It seemed that 15 years of French rule had left almost no trace in the people's sympathies. Or perhaps it had left traces, but not the ones Napoleon had hoped for. Rome knew how to wait things out. That may be its greatest talent. The artifacts taken to Paris were partially returned after long negotiations, during which the papal diplomat Antonio Canova personally traveled to Paris and recovered most of them. But not everything. And some of the pieces that never returned are still the subject of delicate diplomatic conversations between Rome and Paris today. The Grand Rome, its squares, fountains, and cathedrals, existed in parallel with another city that guidebooks never wrote about and official history mentions only reluctantly. The Shadow Rome was no less real and sometimes even more alive. Courtesans in 16th century Rome had their own hierarchy, their own prices, and their own protection. The highest level, the so-called honest courtesans, courtigini honest, were educated women who participated in intellectual discussions, wrote poetry, and knew Latin and Greek. Their clients included cardinals, ambassadors, artists, and bankers. Tullia d'Aragona wrote philosophical dialogues on the nature of love and published them under her own name. Veronica Franco in Venice corresponded with Tintoretto and Montaigne. It was a parallel intellectual world that existed outside universities and academies, which were closed to women. Artists who created masterpieces for popes and cardinals often lived in poverty between commissions. The patronage system gave everything and took everything away at the same time. Dependence on a single patron meant that a change of pope or a cardinal's disfavor could leave a master without means of survival overnight. Some hid from creditors, some drank, some did both. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio is a chapter unto himself. A genius who changed painting more radically than anyone else in his century, and a man who lived like a chronic disaster. Fights, lawsuits, the murder of a man during a tennis game dispute in 1606, and his flight from Rome where a death sentence awaited him. The next 4 years he spent in Naples, Malta, and Sicily, creating masterpieces while fleeing the consequences of his own temper. He died in 1610 on the way back to Rome, possibly on the verge of being pardoned, alone on a beach from fever. The Jewish ghetto, established in 1555 by Pope Paul IV, locked several thousand people into a few blocks between the Tiber and the Theatre of Marcellus. The gates were closed at night. Jews were forbidden from practicing most trades, so they specialized in the trade of second-hand clothing and money lending. Not because they wanted to, but because everything else was closed to them. The ghetto would last until 1870 and would only be abolished after the unification of Italy. The Shadow Rome was not an exception to the rule. It was the rule, just without the marble and the gilding. On September 20, 1870, Italian troops entered Rome through a breach in the Aurelian Wall near Porta Pia. The papal guard offered only symbolic resistance, a few shots, a few wounded. Then the gates were opened. The papal states, which had existed for more than 1,000 years in various forms, ceased to exist in a single morning. Rome became the capital of unified Italy. And it immediately became clear that this was an extremely inconvenient city for such a role. Not because it was small or peripheral, but quite the opposite. It was too big in its symbolic weight, too filled with the past, too complicated for any practical decision. If you wanted to build a new ministry, you would hit an ancient foundation. If you wanted to lay a road, you would run into a necropolis. Rome resisted modernity not out of spite, but simply because under every step lay someone else's modernity that had long since become the past. The first census in 1871 recorded 220,000 inhabitants. For the capital of a country with 20 million people, that was not enough. Bureaucrats, officers, and deputies arrived from Turin, Florence, and Naples, and looked at the city with a mixture of admiration and despair. There was essentially no proper sewage system. They were still using systems that partly dated back to antiquity. There was no proper transport and not enough housing. Malaria still lingered in the suburbs right up until the 20th century. New neighborhoods began to grow from scratch and grew quickly, without a plan and without taste, according to contemporary accounts. Speculators built up the Esquiline and Prati, demolishing villas and gardens that had stood there since the Renaissance. The Rome of the 17th and 18th centuries, the city of popes and pilgrims, began to turn into a city of officials and rentiers. The transformation was ugly and inevitable. The question that arose from the very beginning and still has no clear answer was, who is the real master of a city where every stone belongs to someone? Antiquity, the church, the state, or the tourist imagination? Who decides what to demolish and what to preserve? The first answer from the New Italy turned out to be contradictory and created tensions that continue to this day. Rome was becoming the capital, but it remained itself, stubborn, complicated, impossible, and necessary. Benito Mussolini had a very specific idea of what the capital of a great power should look like. It had to be readable. There had to be a clear, straight line from the ancient to the new, from Caesar to the Duce. Everything that interfered with this line was to be demolished. In 1926 he began clearing the area around the Mausoleum of Augustus. Medieval and Renaissance neighborhoods were torn down to open up the view of the tomb of the first emperor. In 1932, for the 10th anniversary of the Fascist Revolution, the Via dell'Impero was opened, a straight road from the Colosseum to Piazza Venezia, where Mussolini's balcony stood. To build it, several medieval quarters were demolished and parts of the excavated forum were simply buried. They literally covered up exposed antiquity to build a road to another antiquity. This logic of destroy one past to highlight another very accurately reflected the nature of the regime. Selective memory as a tool of power. Rome was supposed to show the version of itself that gave legitimacy to Mussolini. The city of the Caesars, the city of empire, the city that always won and expanded. The Middle Ages did not fit into this scheme. Too complicated, too ecclesiastical, too lacking in triumph. The architectural program of the regime combined two incompatible styles so convincingly that it was strange in itself. On one hand, the display of ancient ruins, excavations, museums, and Trajan's column in the center of new squares. On the other, the massive rationalist architecture of Euro, the new district in the south of Rome built for the 1942 World's Fair that never happened because of the war. Euro, Esposition Universal Roma, still stands today, slightly eerie, perfectly symmetrical, with arches quoting antiquity but on a scale that overwhelms the human being. When the Allies bombed Rome in 1943, Mussolini was already falling. The city survived better than it might have, partly because both sides tried to avoid direct strikes on the historic center. Rome was declared an open city, and it avoided the fate of Warsaw or Dresden. But the price it paid for 20 years of the regime was not only the demolished neighborhoods. It was a rupture in the city's memory that is harder to repair than rebuilding a house. In the summer of 1943, Allied bombers attacked Rome for the first time. The strike on the San Lorenzo railway yard killed about 1,500 civilians and caused such shock that Mussolini fell that same week. The city that considered itself untouchable because of its symbolic importance suddenly realized that no symbolic value could stop an aerial bomb. What happened next is one of the most unusual episodes of the Second World War in Europe. On August 14, 1943, Rome was officially declared an open city, a place that would not defend itself or offer resistance and therefore could not be a legitimate military target. Both sides formally accepted this status. The Allies continued bombing the outskirts and infrastructure but avoided the center. The Germans, after occupying the city following Italy's surrender in September 1943, also did not turn it into a fortress. The reasons on both sides were pragmatic rather than humanitarian. The Allies understood that destroying Rome and the Vatican would give Nazi propaganda priceless material and alienate the Catholic population worldwide. The Germans understood that holding a fortress city during a retreat would be too costly, and destroying Rome would make them outcasts in the eyes of Europe, even among those who might still support them. The 9 months of Nazi occupation from September 1943 to June 1944 remain in the city's memory differently from any other period. The roundup of Jews in October 1943, when more than 1,000 people were deported from the ghetto just a few blocks from the Vatican. The massacre in the Ardeatine caves in March 1944, 335 hostages executed in one night in retaliation for a partisan attack. These events left wounds in the city's memory that have not fully healed to this day. On June 4, 1944, American troops entered Rome. 2 days later the Allies would land in Normandy, and the liberation of Rome would disappear from the front pages. But for the city itself, it was a moment that divided time into before and after. General Mark Clark drove in on a jeep through the gates while crowds threw flowers. The city emerged from the war with damaged suburbs, a traumatized memory, and an almost untouched historic center. Not because it was loved, but because it was too important a symbol for all sides to destroy. This ability to survive through its symbolic weight is yet another manifestation of the same logic that stretches from Alaric to Mussolini. Rome is too complicated to simply break, even when people really want to. On February 11, 1929, Benito Mussolini and Cardinal Pietro Gasparri signed 3 documents in the Lateran Palace that resolved a question that had been hanging in the air for 60 years. Since the entry of Italian troops in 1870, the popes had not recognized the new Italy and called themselves prisoners of the Vatican. Now the agreement gave the Church what it wanted: sovereignty. The Vatican City-State, 110 acres, less than half a square kilometer with a population of about 800 people, became an officially independent state. The smallest by area and one of the most influential by reach. It has its own army, the Swiss Guard, which has been on duty since 1506 and still wears the Renaissance uniforms designed by Michelangelo. Its own currency, its own post office, its own radio station, its own court, and its own prison, though it rarely holds anyone. 2 governments in one city, and the relationship between them is far more complicated than it looks. Every day thousands of people cross the border between the Vatican and Rome without even noticing it, because there are no gates or queues, only a white line on the pavement in front of Bernini's colonnade. The legal systems do not fully align. Jurisdictions overlap and sometimes conflict. Cases involving church property or clergy can fall between 2 legal systems at once. And both systems may find that they don't quite know who has the final say. The Vatican museums are one of the most visited museum complexes in the world. They welcome 6 to 7 million visitors every year who walk through 20 kilometers of galleries to reach the Sistine Chapel. The morning queue for entry is visible from space, or at least from any hill surrounding the city. Income from tourism makes the Vatican economically self-sufficient despite its microscopic size. The Vatican and Rome coexist in a mutual dependence that neither side publicly discusses. Rome needs the pilgrims and tourists attracted by the Vatican. The Vatican needs the city as context, logistics, an airport, and hotels. Between them stretch 60 years of diplomatic relations that have had cracks but have never completely broken. In the 1950s and 1960s, Rome once again became the center of the world, this time through cinema. Cinecittà, the film studio in the south of the city built by Mussolini in 1937 as part of his propaganda program, after the war turned into the largest film complex in Europe. It attracted Hollywood productions so strongly that journalists began calling it Hollywood on the Tiber. The reasons were practical: cheap labor, almost 300 days of sunshine a year, and sets and props left over from the grandiose fascist productions that were perfect for ancient epics. Quo Vadis was filmed here in 1951 with 5,000 extras. Ben-Hur in 1959 featured a reconstruction of Jerusalem on a backlit the size of a small town and chariot races that cost more than the studio's entire previous year of operation. But alongside the Hollywood blockbusters, Rome was making its own cinema. And it turned out to be more important. Federico Fellini shot La Dolce Vita here in 1960, a film that gave its name to an entire era and a whole way of life. Via Veneto with its cafes, hotels, and nightlife became an icon and remains one to this day, even though Fellini himself said that by the time the film came out, the real Via Veneto was already disappearing, replaced by a tourist copy of itself. The word paparazzi became a symbol of a new culture where public and private life blurred beyond recognition. Rome in the 1960s was the city where this happened first and where it was filmed better than anywhere else. Cinecittà has survived rises and falls. The television crisis of the 1970s, decline in the 1980s, revival in the 1990s when Martin Scorsese filmed Gangs of New York here. Today the studio is still working, hosting television productions and organizing tourist tours of the remaining sets. Ancient Rome, built of wood and plaster for some Hollywood epic, stands in the open air and slowly decays. Yet another layer of the past waiting for its new purpose. 3 million inhabitants and about 40 million tourists a year. A city where traffic jams form because they found a necropolis under the road and construction has been frozen for years. Where you cannot open a new hotel without an archaeological survey, and expanding a basement can turn into a decade of legal and scientific procedures. Where tourists throw coins into the Trevi fountain, and the city collects about €1 million from the bottom every year and uses it for social needs. The Rome Metro is a tragicomedy of its own. Construction of the first line began in the 1930s, the second in the 1960s, the third in the 1990s, and it is still not finished, because every new dig uncovers something new. At Republica Station they found the ruins of the baths of Diocletian and put them behind glass so passengers can see antiquity right from the platform. The Colosseum stood in scaffolding for years, simultaneously undergoing restoration and revealing new discoveries during that same restoration. The question of who owns this city has become even sharper in the 21st century. The tourist economy is pushing residents out of the historic center. Rental prices in the Centro Storico are so high that most Romans simply cannot afford to live there. Airbnb and hotels are taking over spaces that were once apartments. Tourists want to see Rome, and by their presence they change the very thing they came to see. And yet the city holds on. Not because someone decided to preserve it, but because it is too complicated to be easily changed. Every attempt to radically rebuild Rome has run into resistance made up of legal procedures, archaeological finds, church claims, municipal bureaucracy, and simply the character of its inhabitants, who know how to wait longer than any government. Under the city there are still undiscovered areas. There are unmapped sections of catacombs. There are unexcavated parts of the Forum. There are aqueducts that have not been fully studied. Rome is not exhausted. And it seems it never will be. We started with a swamp, a flooded valley between 7 hills where nothing was supposed to grow. And we have traveled 3,000 years to a city where they have been building the metro for 45 years because under every step they find someone else's past, too important to simply tunnel through. What actually makes a city immortal? We asked this question at the beginning and returned to it several times along the way. Now there is an answer, or at least a version that is hard to refute. Not walls. The Aurelian walls were breached in a single morning in 1870. Not armies. The legions dispersed, the generals died, the soldiers were buried without names. Not rulers. Kings, consuls, dictators, emperors, popes, duces, they all came and went. Not even ideas. Because ideas changed radically, from republic to principate, from paganism to Christianity, from empire to church-state, from papal monarchy to tourist democracy. What remained was the ability to absorb. Rome took those who came to conquer it: Etruscans, Sabines, Gauls, Goths, Lombards, Normans. And after a generation they became Romans. Or Rome became their city. It is hard to say who absorbed whom. But the city continued. What remained was the ability to change its purpose without changing itself. The Forum became a cow pasture, then an archaeological park. The Colosseum became a fortress, a quarry, then a symbol. Hadrian's mausoleum became a castle, a prison, a museum. Every structure outlived its original purpose and found a new one. Not because someone planned it that way, but simply because it stood and waited. And what remained was memory, woven into the urban fabric. In Rome it is impossible to walk without walking on someone else's past. Literally. Under the asphalt lies a Roman paved road. Under that, a necropolis. Under that, perhaps something else. The city is layered time. And so far, none of the layers has gone anywhere. If you are still here, it means the story was worth your time. Thank you for making it to the end. Or for falling asleep somewhere along the way and finishing it in the morning. That also counts. Next time, another city. Which one? Write in the comments what you would like to hear. We read everything and choose what seems the most interesting to tell. Your ideas have already brought us some of the best episodes. Good night. Or good morning. Depending on when you're listening.